Hey, welcome to a spooky Halloween edition of Christina Doesn't Shut the Up, starring me, Christina. Now, in all seriousness, I've been told that people enjoy hearing me talk about stuff. Talk is a strong word, maybe ramble about stuff. But before the hot air once again builds up and I spontaneously combust, I'm going to bestow some more useless knowledge onto the masses for my own health. Today I'm going to be talking about spooky sound compilation albums throughout the years. What is a spooky sound compilation album, you might ask? Well, it is the albums that you put on maybe in the background of a Halloween party or putting it on for the trick-or-treaters. They had cute little spooky Halloween-y sounds like a witch laughing, a bubbling cauldron, maybe some scurrying rats, a howling wolf, someone getting decapitated, stuff like that. So these spooky horror sound compilation albums, they started to become very popular around the 60s and 70s. And I'm sure there were hundreds of really, really obscure companies that made them. But there were some main companies that did. One of them is called Pickwick. Pickwick was a company that already existed that released albums that had children's songs on them and things like that. When they got into this particular genre, they released a really popular one called Sounds of Terror. And then they later released another one called Sleepy Hollow, which is basically an album with the reading of the Sleepy Hollow story with some sound effects. And it was read by Boris Karloff. Another company that released a popular one was in 1975 when a company called Peter Pan made an album called Ghostly Sounds. There were also the Hallmark tapes. Hallmark came out with some spooky sound and spooky song tapes. There was Sounds of Halloween from 1986 and Spooky Sounds from 1989. Side one of these tapes was just a compilation of spooky sounds, and then when you flip them over on side two, they had a bunch of songs that were considered to be in the Halloween genre, like Thriller, Monster Mash, Twilight Zone theme, songs like that. Another company called Power Records throughout the 1970s released a bunch of albums of various horror stories being read by different celebrities. Now, one of the most popular groups of these albums was created by the BBC collection, which I will elaborate on in a sec. Very, very early on in my life, I developed a love for these types of albums. My specific story is when my father went to a Sam Goody music store back in the 90s, and when he was paying for whatever he was buying, he looked next to the register, and they had a stack of CDs they were giving away called Sounds of Horror 2. He saw the creepy skull on the front of it and the name of it and was like, oh, my daughter would love this. So he grabbed one for me. I ended up first using it for a Goosebumps themed birthday party that I had. But after that, I just listened to it as, I'm not even kidding you, a comfort CD. The Sounds of Horror 1 and 2 albums were made by an independent small company called Excelsior. Could have been one dude in his basement. I have no idea. But I loved it. It was so cool. It had, sounds that were actually pretty spooky, but also some beautiful sounds of rain and organs playing, and it had everything. And this is really funny. My friends and I would do this thing where I would turn my stereo all the way up to 10 and press play, and the first sound on the album that would play was a super loud clap of thunder. So we would wait for the thunder to blast and then scream, "Hit the deck!" and then jump over my bed as quickly as we could. I also did have a bunch of these albums in the form of tapes, one of them which my mother mistakenly recorded over. So just imagine my surprise when I put it in to hear, "When you want it the most, there's no easier way out." I have since forgiven her. So back to the main focus of this video, the BBC collection. They released an incredible series of horror sound compilations over the years. So first we have Death and Horror, Volume 13 from 1977. Then we have more Death and Horror from 1978. Then, you guessed it, even more Death and Horror from 1982. Then in 1990, they had sort of a repackaging, remastering essentials situation that they released called Death and Horror Sound Effects Volume 1. So back in the 70s when they started doing this, they recruited a guy named Mike Harding, who was one of the well-known members of the BBC Radiophonic Workshop. And he teamed up with another guy that worked for BBC for the label named Ian Richardson. These guys spent hours upon hours, days upon days, sitting around and listening to every little soundbite in the BBC Radiophonic Workshop library to pick out the creepiest ones to put on this compilation. And even so, with all of those sounds available in that library, they still came to the conclusion that they needed to create some sounds of their own. A majority of these later created sounds were made by, well, this is a direct quote from Richardson himself, were created by mistreating large white cabbages. They would chop them with cleavers, poke them with sticks, kick them, whatever they had to do. There were even some more complex sounds that were created with cabbages, such as sliding a metal pole down a coat rack and mixing that with chopping a cabbage in half, causing it to fall into a basket filled with hay, which would create the guillotine sound. In a later interview, Richardson said while the sounds were highly realistic and successful in that way from using the cabbages, they also wound up with a bunch of coleslaw for that week, so it was a win-win. So in 1977, upon the release of Death and Horror, Volume 13, there was a lot of controversy attached to it. Its implied violent content captured the attention of anti-obscenity campaigner Mary Whitehouse. She was very outspoken with her criticism of BBC and their utter lack of responsibility releasing an album like this, and she even had it pulled from shelves for some time. Then, like basically everything, it returned to stock eventually and actually wound up selling, give or take, 20,000 extra copies because of the controversy, because that's how things go. All right, so I just gotta say for a second, I really appreciate these people and their fixation on the horror sound genre because it caused them to meticulously go through all these sounds and organize them in a fashion that is so satisfying. We have categories like intentional death with subcategories like staking a vampire, 3 mallet blows, just 3, 2 throat cuts, or 2 throats cut. We also have another category, torture, like tongue pulled out, very specific, fingernails pulled out. Wonder if they use the cabbage for any of that. We also have the 4th category, which is reaction. In parentheses it says to the sounds you just heard. There's only one sound for that. Involuntary regurgitation. And you definitely can't go without one of the last categories, nasty animals and birds, with subcategories like werewolves and giant killer bees. So in closing, I'm going to leave you with this statement that Richardson made when he advocated for himself and others in his line of work. A recording of horror sound effects? Who needs sound effects for executions and gory things like that? It's surely the visual aspect of any horror film which sends tingles down your back and makes your hair stand on end. Not true. Next time you stay up to watch the late night film on the TV, turn the sound down and you'll find that not only does the speech disappear, but also those all-important sound effects. So spare a thought for the men and women who make them. They deafen themselves banging tin sheets making thunder, soak themselves with water for a Chinese water torture effect, and tramp up and down gravel pits for hours, providing necessary creepy footsteps. So yeah, hopefully I was able to shed some light on another niche subject for some people. Oh, also, if anybody's curious and wants to check out the horror compilation CD that was close to my heart, Sounds of Horror 2, I actually uploaded it to YouTube recently, so I'll leave the link and you can check it out.